good to be here again for the third session of this series, which I entitled Stranger, Neighbor, Citizen, Polish Jewry in History and Historiography. And I want to emphasize the subtitle here, Polish Jewry in History and Historiography. In our first two sessions, we also spent a lot of time talking about both image and reality, about reality and how we write about reality, and we're going to do the same thing today when we talk about the interwar period. I entitled today's lecture, Good or Bad for the Jews, Jewish Life in Interwar Poland, which is following the title of a well-known article by my late colleague and mentor, Professor Ezra Mendelsohn, who wrote an article with this title, and a very influential one at that. And I hope we can follow in his tradition of history and historiography. We've come to a very, very new period now. In the previous lecture, we saw the end of Polish independence, and now at the end of World War I, literally the last day of World War I, Poland regains its independence on November 11th, 1918. But this is part of a much larger process in the post-war settlement, particularly in East Central Europe. Because what we get are a series of new states, ranging from Estonia in the north all the way to Yugoslavia in the south. And these are the so-called successor states to the great multinational empires which collapsed in the First World War, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, at least in this area of Europe. We all remember, I think, from high school history, President Wilson of the United States and his 14 points, one of them being self-determination of nations as a principle of the post-war, the new Europe of peace after the destruction of World War I. And this idea is wonderful in theory, but in practice, on the ground, particularly in Eastern Europe, at any one point on the map, any place you place your finger, you might find 2, 3, and 4 different nationalities in that particularly small area. So the question was, again, how can you draw the map? And beyond that, once you draw the map, what do you do about the people who are on the quote-unquote wrong side of the border? That is, the wrong side of their national ethnic state. And the solution that they came up with was the notion of minority rights. That every new state, including Poland, which in a sense is a new old state, but it's still a new state in their minds, had to sign a treaty to guarantee the rights, equal rights, opportunities, funding for national minorities within their borders. And Jews were also considered to be a national minority in this sense. Poland as a new state had a great deal of adjustments to make. First of all, there was the great destruction of World War I, when Poland, Polish territory, was a battleground between the contending sides in World War I for several points during the war. Beyond that, Poland, as we learned before, was living under 3 different regimes for 125 plus years, and now they had to unite these 3 parts of the country into one state with one bureaucracy, with one government, and also, in a sense, to unite 3 different Jewish communities. Ezra Mendelsohn talked about the Jewries of Poland, not just Polish Jewry. And Poland, throughout the interwar period, suffered from general poverty and economic weakness, most particularly the loss of the Russian market, which was so important for Poland's industrial development in the late 19th century. The new Poland, reborn Poland, was a Poland that was not wholly Polish ethnically. In fact, it had 1/3 of the population were national minorities. So with the different visions of the Polish state, most of them, particularly of the Polish right wing, saw Poland as a Polish ethnic Catholic state, and the minorities as a troublesome phenomenon, reality, but not to be treated equally, certainly in the national sense, despite the fact that Poland was a signatory of these minorities treaties. And in fact, the proof in the pudding was that for all of these new countries, only 2 of the new countries pretty much observed the treaties, the minorities treaties, and how they treated their minorities, and that is Estonia in the far north and Yugoslavia in the far south. All the other countries, shall we say, fudged in dealing with these minority treaty obligations, which had to be inserted into the constitution of the state. And yet, for Jews and others, these were just theories, but not necessarily reality, and could not be relied upon. Poland also was a country with security issues on every side. There were conflicts with her neighbors, including a major war with the Soviet Union in 1920, 1921. So there were a lot of problems in the new Poland. The Jewish community in Poland was the largest in Europe, around 3 million by the time of the eve of World War II, up to almost 3.5 million. And we have to keep in mind that everything we say about Polish Jewry, we have to think big. Even small percentages of the Polish Jewish community would be larger than the entire Jewish community of England, the entire Jewish community of France, and other countries as well. And Polish Jewry, as such, stood out as an urban population in a generally rural country, so that many cities, including the capital of Warsaw, the second largest city, Lodz, and others, had a third, a quarter, and sometimes even a majority of Jewish inhabitants. So when we use the Yiddish term, the Yiddische Gasse, the Jewish street, in many ways in Poland there still was a Jewish street. That Jewish street in the interwar period might not be broadcasting one message about Jewishness and Jewish identity, but it was a Jewish street nonetheless. Now, how do we look at this period? Again, it's the question of narrative and not just the question of reality. There is, first of all, what we could call the lachrymose, the sad approach, with the shadow of the Holocaust coloring the narrative. Of course, nobody knew in the interwar period that there was going to be a Holocaust. But also contemporary materials, like the book in the middle of the slide here, People at Bay by Oskar Janowski, was published in the late 30s, and he talked about the Jewish problem in East Central Europe, and he was very pessimistic about the long-term survival possibilities of the Jewish communities in East Central Europe, particularly Poland. And the book on the right in Yiddish by Yaakov Leszczynski, At the Edge of the Abyss. Again, the title already gives you a clue as to what the contents of the book are. And Celia Heller's book from 1977, an important book, On the Edge of Destruction, Jews of Poland Between the Two World Wars. But again, the Jews of Poland between the two world wars did not know they were on the edge of destruction. We know that. And how does this affect the way we talk about this period? Older narratives talking about this period, the historians, saw the interwar period particularly from the political angle. That this was a political struggle, both of Jews vis-a-vis the Polish regime and of Jews among themselves. This was a national community with a national identity fighting for its rights. And this was a time of what we could call total politics, or what we might also call cradle-to-grave politics, where a person could, under party auspices, go to a nursery, kindergarten, elementary school, high school, health fund, women's organization, men's organization, youth group, all under party auspices. And history writing itself in that period was seen as an extension of politics, mostly with a pro-Zionist approach. And if you look at the titles of the books on the slide here. They all have certain words which stand out here. The one on the left, it's hard to read. It's Ma'avak Yehudei Polin, the struggle of Jews of Poland for their rights. Of Moshe Landau's book, the one in yellow, Mi'ut Le'umi Lochem, a fighting national minority. Or Yitzhak Greenbaum, who was both a politician and a writer, Milchamot Yehudei Polin, the wars of the Jews of Poland. And we are fortunate in just the last few months that we have a fine book by Professor Natalia Alexiun of Touro College entitled Conscious History, where she talks about the whole generation of Polish Jewish historians in the interwar period who were educated in universities and begin their work. Not all of them, most of them did not survive the Holocaust, but some of their works did. But she shows again the use of history as a tool for promoting identity and also for promoting the part of Jews within Poland and Polish society. Later generations, closer to our time, have tried to correct and widen the older narrative. First of all, by widening and completing the picture of the political spectrum. So we have here on the slide a book about the Mizrahi by Asaf Kaniel, a book by Gertrude Pican, Against the Stream, which is about the Bund, the socialist, non-Zionist or anti-Zionist party, and my own volume about Agudat Yisrael. But beyond that, there's more sophisticated approaches to politics using new sources, new approaches, and new tools. But history writing about Polish Jewry, and particularly the interwar period, has entered a new period in the past 10 years or so. There still may be cradle-to-grave politics, but politics was not everything in the life of Polish Jews, and it shouldn't be everything in writing the history of Polish Jews. Instead, we find historians looking at long-term processes, including politicization itself, like Scott Urey's fine book, Barricades and Banners, talking about the 1905 revolution and the development of both Jewish and Polish politics in the early 20th century. Or the book on the left by Kamil Kijek, Children of Modernism, where he talks about the whole generation of the interwar Polish Jews who grew up in interwar Poland, educated in interwar Poland, and in a sense were socialized in interwar Poland, and how their identity was developed. And finally, and the second book there from the left talks about the process of assimilation of Jews among Polish Jews in the interwar period. And on the right, there's a doctoral dissertation, a fascinating one by Daniel Rosenthal, talking about attitudes toward death among interwar Polish Jews and talking about the development of the funeral industry. And it's a fascinating piece of work, again, talking about longer-term processes and not just about politics. Another important addition to the writing of Polish Jewish history is the addition of Polish historians who spend their time talking about Jews and writing about Jews. And one of the pioneers in this field was the late Professor Jerzy Tomaszewski. And you can see here the covers of 3 of his books. And I'll just mention the one in the center and on the right, which already tells you something about his view. The one in the middle is called A Multinational Republic. And the one on the right, The Fatherland is Not Just Poles. And he talks about all the national minorities. This has to be part of Polish history as far as Tomaszewski was concerned. Now, alongside what we might call a more liberal approach, a more inclusive approach to the national minorities, there still are hints of a more right-wing Polish view or pro-Polish view, in this case by 2 authors who live in England, one of them a source book, and the other Norman Davies, Professor Norman Davies' monumental 2-volume history of Poland called God's Playground. And Davies says in the 2nd volume, talking about the interwar period, he says, all was not well, but neither was it unrelieved gloom, which is a nice way to put a positive face on was not necessarily the most positive period as far as treatment of Jews and minorities was concerned. How do we talk about Polish Jews? For many, Polish Jews are identified with the shtetl, even though most Polish Jews lived in cities and towns and not in shtetlach. But nevertheless, the shtetl is important both as a symbol, but also part of the reality of Polish Jewry. And one of the things which we've tried to come up with terms for in our first two lectures, and we continue now, I talked about strangers, neighbors, citizens, but how do we characterize the special relationships between Poles and Jews? And here we see two very good examples of an attempt to characterize those relationships. The book by my friend and colleague Shimon Redlich called Together and Apart in Brzezany, where he talks about Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians in his hometown. So you get the notion of together and apart. There is another book and article called Distant Intimacy, or the book of Rosa Lehmann in the middle, Symbiosis and Ambivalence. Again, they're working together in some small Galician town. Jews and Poles work together, cooperate on a daily basis, but there's an ambivalence about the relationship. The Jews are still strange, are still strangers in many ways. And a very fine book by the author Eva Hoffman called Shtetl, which, as its name implies, talks about one particular shtetl, the shtetl of Bryansk. And again, the special relationships between Poles and Jews in the shtetl, which may not be exactly the same, it may be more intimate than those relations in the big cities, but nevertheless, there's something special about the relationship. And sometimes single authors try to sum up a Jewish community, their Jewish community. They write a kind of personal Yizkor book. So Theo Richman has the book Kon in a Quest, which was also translated into Hebrew for those who might be interested. Professor Yafa Eliach wrote about her town of Aishishuk called There Once Was a World, and it's a very fine book. She's responsible for the pictures and everything in the Hall of Names in Yad Vashem. And finally, one of my favorite memoirs of the period. Remember last time we talked about the seal of the town of Kolbushova with the cross and the Star of David and the two shaking hands. Norman Zalzitz grew up in that town, and he wrote about his Jewish boyhood in Poland, his Hasidic family, his father, who loved Polish language and Polish culture, but yet many times was rebuffed by some of their Polish neighbors or his teachers in school. It's a book very much worth reading. When we talk about Poland and Polish Jewry, in a sense we're talking about very contrasting images of a religious community, of a secular or secularizing community, of a traditional community. In a sense, it's our job as both historians and readers trying to understand what was happening to present the multilingual and multifaceted culture and social life of Polish Jews, and not to focus on one small corner of that society. And of course, there are many cultural stereotypes that have to be overcome, so-called Polishness, all the Polish Jewish mother jokes we might know from the States, the I'll prefer to sit in the dark, and also in Israel, the notion of Polaniyut, Polishness, which is the subject of jokes, of satires. There's a well-known Israeli satire TV program called Zehu Zeh, and they had a series of skits on the Polaniyot of three actors, men getting dressed up as women who are pretending to be, in a sense, like middle-class Polish Jewish women with all kinds of stereotypical gestures, words, and ways of talking. And of course, when we talk about Poland, we have to talk of the image of Poland and the Poles, and the question of anti-Semitism, which we'll get to later in the talk. But I just wanted to show you at the bottom of the slide two dueling images of Polish Jewry. On the left, we have a poster for football matches. It says in Yiddish there, football matchen between Maccabi Baranovich and Hakoyach Pinsk. I don't know if they were leading teams in the league at that time or not, But nevertheless, when we usually think of Baranovich, most of us in the Orthodox community think of the yeshiva of Baranovich and not Maccabi Baranovich. But there was, and you see that their games were on Shabbos and Zintik, on Shabbat and on Sunday. And on the other hand, we have the famous iconic images of the photographer Roman Wiśniak, who traveled around Poland in 1936 and 1937 and snapped thousands of pictures. Many of them have become the iconic images of what Polish Jewry was. And of course, he stresses the religious community. We talk about dueling images again in the visual and in the literary realms. So if we start at the bottom left, in 1946, Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel delivered, in a sense, what was a hesped, a kind of obituary for Polish Jewry, and he entitled it "The Earth is the Lord's," where he presented Polish Jewry as the quintessential holy community. And it was just poetic and beautiful in Heschel's style, but it was a one-sided presentation of Polish Jewry. And it is said that at the end of Heschel's remarks, the entire congregation at YIVO, which is mostly secular Jews, stood up spontaneously and recited the Kaddish. At the opposite extreme of Heschel's portrayal of Polish Jewry is the book in the middle, Image Before My Eyes, which came out in the 1980s, edited by Professor Lucjan Dobroszycki, my teacher, and also Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett. And this presents the everyday Polish Jews along with the religious Polish Jews. And there was also a video made of this, the one you see on the right. And of course, in the literary scene, the kind of polar opposite of Heschel's image of Polish Jewry is Isaac Bashevis Singer, who shows us what we might say the more seamy side, the more sexual side, Jewish criminals and other things in Polish Jewry. So we look for a balance between these images and also these literary portrayals. Also, there was another author and photographer named Alter Kaczyzna, who was a kind of a staff photographer of Polish Jewry for the Falverts in New York. And his book, his photographs, his best photographs, were published together in this book called Poland, or Poland. But again, there is a lasting legacy of Roman Wiśniak. His book, Polish Jews, and his book, A Vanished World. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, his entire photo archive is available at the website that's listed on the slide, where you can see hundreds and hundreds of pictures. He also took some movies. His claim was that a lot of his stuff was confiscated by the Polish police, and therefore what we have is only a part of what he photographed. And Wiśniak afterwards made a career, a totally different career. He became one of the most famous photographers through the microscope, the microscopic world of bacteria and viruses, etc., totally different from his career as a cataloger of the life of Polish Jews. And certainly, when we go to memoirs, there are hundreds of memoirs in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in English, in Polish, in many other languages of Polish Jews. And I here put on the slide just a few of what I think are some of the most important. Rabbi Ben-Zion Gold wrote a really timeless portrayal of the life of Jews in Poland before the Holocaust, coming from a religious family, but he's very aware of the winds of secularization and its effect on Polish Jews. It's a short but very memorable book. The historian Theodor Hamerow wrote again, Remembering a Vanished World, A Jewish Childhood in Interwar Poland. And he is from a secular family, and his mother was an actress in the Yiddish theater who didn't really speak Yiddish. She had to memorize all of her lines, but she was a famous actress in the Yiddish theater, in the famous Wilner Truppe, and he writes about his parents, his family, where he lived, and it's very much worth reading. The writer-poet Yaakov Gladstein wrote 2 books about a travel narrative, going to Poland. He was going for his mother's funeral, and he writes about his trip to Poland by boat and then when he arrives. And these 2 books were published together as the Gladstein Chronicles, and particularly the 2nd volume is worth reading because it gives us, he goes to a resort, and we are exposed to every type of Polish Jew who are vacationing at this resort, and we see what they say. And this, Gladstein wrote it when he came back to America before the war broke out. But we see the feelings, the emotions, the hopes, the dreads of Polish Jews on the eve of the Holocaust. And there are books which are devoted to single shtetlach, lives remembered. Here, a shtetl through a photographer's eye, and it talks about a small shtetl called Szczucin, and it's a combination, again, of text and wonderful pictures which survived the war. But our work is certainly far from finished when we try to talk about the interwar period. We have to do a lot more work on the younger generation, both in the sense of their education and reaction to education, in their work in the youth groups, and many other aspects of this younger generation who have their initiation into politics. And there are issues of gender and women's history, which also, in a sense, are just getting off the ground in a large sense. And of course, there is the notion of what we call history from below, looking from the view of simple people, not just political leaders or community leaders. And how does this affect our larger narrative, this personal and local history? And here I put on the slide Rosa Luxemburg, the famous revolutionary of Jewish origins, Sarah Schneerer, the founder of the Beis Yaakov movement, and the diary of Victor Chayes, who was a community leader and activist in Lvov. And his diary was discovered in the library in Krakow in the early 1990s, and Penina Meislich graciously translated it from Polish into Hebrew. And the title, again, talks about all our same issues of identity. Gam Yehudi, Gam Polani. Both Jewish and Polish. So this is still an issue as far as the writer. He didn't call it that, of course, but she did, and it very much reflects the content of this diary. How did Jews live their everyday life? In the big cities, Jewish life took place in the Hof, the courtyard. Here we have the famous Warsaw Street, Nalewki Street, and you see that life goes on in the courtyard. The big streets are on the outside of these buildings, but the front of the buildings face into the courtyard. That's where the stores are, that's where the pedestrians walk, and that's where everyday life took place. And we'll see a rare film of 2 minutes of one of those courtyards toward the end of our evening tonight. But what else was everyday life for Polish Jews? Now, the picture on the left, if you looked at it, and I didn't tell you this was from Poland, I think most people would say, oh, this is a Tel Aviv beach, or this is Coney Island, or this is Atlantic City. But this is actually from the 1930s in Sopot, which is in the north of Poland on the Baltic, near Danzig. And here's some Jews who want to have fun on the beach, or a Jewish soccer team, again. Or everyday life means boxing and sports, including the Polish flyweight champion, Lazar Runstein, and a poster. You can see the word in Polish, boks, for boxing, and it talks about a Jewish boxing club versus a Polish boxing club. And on the other hand, we have other things of everyday life which we wouldn't necessarily associate with Polish Jewry, and that is a beauty contest for Miss Judea from 1929, which was sponsored by the very popular Polish Jewish newspaper, Nasz Przegląd, and they had an illustrated additional section on Fridays. And here we see the winner on the cover and another one of the contestants on the right. And again, this is part of the everyday life of Polish Jewry. Not everyone is in shul, not everyone is in the Beit Midrash. And not only that, that Polish Jews, part of their everyday life was being rooted in Poland and their feeling for being rooted in Poland. So again, I would sometimes show the picture on the left to classes, and I would say, what is this? So they'd say, oh, this is a tiyul, a Zionist youth group someplace, maybe in Palestine, maybe in Europe. But actually it's a tiyul, it's a hike by a group of Bundist youth, of leftist socialist Jews, who are getting to know Poland. And in the same way, in the right, there was a whole movement called the Landkenntnis movement, the movement to know the land. And again, to know the land was to know Poland. And so there was a kind of Jewish path through Poland, but in which they felt very much rooted. Of course, everyday life included the religious community, who were a major part. I think every time I give a lecture on the interwar period, the first question, sometimes the only question, which arises when there's question time, and I won't be surprised if it's in the chat tonight, well, tell me, Professor, what percentage of Jews in Poland were religious at this time? And my answer is usually a kind of educated guess of somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, which of course is very large percentage, certainly compared to the United States at that time or other countries. And here we see a picture of, on the left, of two Jews playing chess in a resort town. And on the right, we see one of the young descendants of the Alexander Hasidic dynasty being accompanied by some other Hasidim in his walk in the woods. So everyday life included religious Jews as well. We said before that Jewish politics, in a sense, reached its apogee in interwar Poland, in the sense of the variety of political parties, in the sense of the number of votes that they achieved at the polls. But there was no dominant force in Polish Jewish politics. The Zionists seemed to have the most, but close behind was Agudat Yisrael and the Bund. So you have the Zionists left, center, and right. You have the Aguda, and you have the Bund. And if we see just a few pictures about the Bund, so they had their rallies, they have their sports teams, and as Jack Jacobs says in his book, their whole Bundes counterculture. They came up with an alternative Yiddishist counterculture, schools, youth movements, music, theme songs, everything, and marches on the 1st of May and other occasions. So the Bundes had their own kind of life. Zionism, of course, had its institutions, youth groups. Posters are often very, very colorful. I just took two. One to support the Tarbut movement, which had Hebrew elementary and some Hebrew high schools in Poland, which were taught Ivrit be'Ivrit. And on the right, the Hashomer HaTzair, the anniversary, 10th anniversary of the Vilna group of Hashomer HaTzair. And Agudat Yisrael had its own institutions, political, youth, and for women, for men. And here we see the top left, students of a Beis Yaakov school. On the top right, the banner of the Aguda school organization called Chorev. The bottom left, the building of the Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, which was a kind of super yeshiva in the Hasidic areas of Poland. And finally, a kind of election flyer, which says that all strong religious Jews vote for the list of Agudat Yisrael. So politics was there, politics was present, but it was not all-consuming. And another reality of Polish Jewish life was, of course, anti-Semitism. And we can divide the period up into a few sub-periods. First of all, there was an ongoing boycott of Jewish businesses by Polish parties of the right and private organizations that promoted a boycott of Jewish businesses that began already in 1912, even before World War I and before Polish independence. With the arrival of Polish independence in the first 2 years, we find violence against Jews, particularly in the eastern regions. And again, in 1936 to 1939, we find a number of pogroms against Jews. And then there's the so-called Owszem policy. After 1935, after the death of Marshal Pilsudski, who was someone who basically reined in anti-Semitism as much as possible, when he died, a fully right-wing government took power. And when the prime minister spoke after some Jewish deputies complained of violence, he said, "We are absolutely against physical violence against Jews. Economic boycott, that's another story. Owszem, that's another story. Adraba, that's something else." And another reality of interwar Polish Jewish life was ongoing discrimination in government employment, in the army. Even though there was a compulsory draft, we find that Jews were restricted from, for the most part, from the officer corps, which was considered one of the elites of Polish society. There were some Jewish officers, but not too many. And this is even more blatant act of discrimination in the sense that most officers were recruited from university graduates. And Jews had a relatively high number of university graduates, but nevertheless, they were not taken for officer training in the army. And there were quotas in the universities themselves. Universities in Poland enjoyed amount of full autonomy, to the fact that the police or the army were not allowed onto the campuses unless there was an imminent danger of riot. Up until then, the universities were off limits to the police and to the army. And the universities, one by one, faculty by faculty, start introducing quotas against Jewish students, to the point that at the beginning of the period, Jews were about 20% of the university students. By the end of the period, in the late 1930s, Jews were down to less than their percentage in the population. Jews were about 10%. It went down to about 8% of university students. This does not mean that Polish Jews did not get higher education. Those who were stymied by the quota system went to other countries. So medical students went to study in Prague to come back to Poland. Other students who wanted to study sciences went to Switzerland, went to Germany even, went to Prague to study sciences to come back to Poland. But there was also discrimination, and this is critically important during the Depression period after 1929, of granting credit to businesses and also in getting unemployment benefits. What was the basis for Polish anti-Semitism? I remember someone asked this already last time in the questions. And there's a combination of traditional Christian motifs, modern racial ideas, borrowing from the Nazis and others, and something particularly blatant in Poland, the so-called accusation of the Żydokomuna, that Jews were somehow responsible for communism, for trying to bring communism to Poland the way they brought communism to Russia. And this notion of Żydokomuna can be heard even on websites and YouTubes from Poland even to this day. The posters you see, both on this slide and I'll show you on the next one quickly, it says, first of all, a kind of hand-lettered, very primitive sign, which is in the collection of the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. It says, "Polish peasant, buy only from a Pole. The Jew is your enemy, and the enemy of the fatherland. So the word wróg, which means enemy in Polish, so here you will see this repeated again and again. The Jew is the enemy. The Jew is the ultimate other. In fact, Joanna Michlitz has a fine book called Poland's Threatening Other, where she talks about the development of anti-Semitism. And we have other anti-Semitic images. I think the one on the left needs almost no explanation. The Jew is a swindler. He's your only enemy. Again, the word wróg, W-R-O-G. And here you see the Jew selling meat is mixing in, chopping up mice in there. The Jew selling milk is adulterating the milk with water. And the Jewish baker is pounding the loaf with his feet and with all kinds of bugs crawling all over it. And the one on the right says Polish workers. The Polish Socialist Party has placed as on its list number 2 in Warsaw the candidacy of the Jew Felix Perl, who was a Jew, not a particularly identified one, the editor of Robotnik, which was the socialist newspaper, and it says, Polish workers, isn't it a disgrace for you that your representative in the Polish capital should be a Jew? And finally, 2 more images. Na Lefkovic Street, remember we saw the Hof, the inner courtyard of Na Lefkovic Street, was one of the classic Jewish streets in the Jewish neighborhoods of Warsaw. So here you see the Jew with the big nose and with the fangs and people coming out of his mouth. And the Jew is the source of every kind of corruption and demoralization, whether it's prostitution, whether it's desertion, whether it's thievery. All of these things come from the Jew. Crime comes from the Jew. And the rather primitive cartoon on the right, which again was probably given out as a flyer, where you see a bunch of Jews stuffing themselves in a restaurant while poor Poles are standing by begging for food and not being answered by the Jews who continue eating. But what's important to me, again, is the not particularly good poem at the end of this. And I'll just translate it. Remember that whether in summer day or winter evening, the Jew is your worst enemy, again the word wróg, because he is an internal. He's an enemy at home. So this is the kind of image that Jews could encounter. And even on the university campuses, there would be signs up saying Jews not wanted. In the university campuses in the late 1930s, they instituted so-called ghetto benches, where Jewish students could sit only on one side of the lecture hall and couldn't sit together with the Poles, again to make them feel out. We talked before about the younger generation. And one of the most important sources for getting to the voice of the younger generation was the autobiography contests that were run in the 1930s by the YIVO Institute in Vilna. Now it's in New York. And there were collected about 900 of these youth autobiographies. About 300 or so, 350, survived the war. And they have been published, and they're supposedly being digitized now, and they will be available to everyone once the digitation process is completed. But here we have a Hebrew anthology, a Polish anthology, and an English anthology from these very important youth autobiographies, which have both literary and historical value. And I would urge people interested in the period to look into these books. But besides everything else, there was also a quiet revolution going on, what I called, in an article of mine, the victory of schooling. That in interwar Poland, despite the fact that the Jewish school systems were the largest that there were in Europe, about 60 to 70% of Jewish students actually were educated in Polish public schools. So here we have a picture of a so-called Shabbosówka school for boys in Warsaw. Shabbosówka, from the word Shabbos, meant that this was a public school where most of the students were Jewish, so that sessions were not held on Shabbat, but were held on Sunday instead. But this was the place of education of much of the younger generation. Now, some got Jewish education in the Cheder or in other Jewish schools as supplementary education, but still, this was a quiet revolution that was brewing, to the point that in the 1930s, many of the younger generation already regarded Polish rather than Yiddish as their first language. Polish Jewish politics was rough and tumble, but there was still an uneasy unity. There was a Jewish faction in the Polish parliament where all the parties were members, and there were philanthropic organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee and the others that helped local aid societies and coordinated between them. So this was a Jewish community that was not totally united politically, ideologically, or religiously, but nevertheless there was a basic level of cooperation. Since we cannot hope to cover this very, very rich historical period, I just wanted to call to your attention the fact that there are gateways to the period in different languages for those who want to follow up, for example, about their parents' or grandparents' hometown, or about any other city or town in Poland you might be interested in. But first of all, we have the major project of the National Library here in Jerusalem of putting online the Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, and Jewish press from Poland online, besides Jewish press from other countries. And it's worthwhile exploring just to look at what was written in an everyday newspaper on a regular day in interwar Poland. The Yizkor books, written after the Holocaust, is also a major source of information about the interwar period. Of course, the Yizkor books focus a lot on the Holocaust period, but just about every Yizkor book has a major chapter on the period before the Holocaust. And the Yiddish Book Center and the New York Public Library have online a collection of over 600 Yizkor books. And some of these Yizkor books are translated partially or completely into English on the Jewish genealogy site entitled Jewish Gen. And finally, what I find a gem of a site, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency uploaded all of its archive in a searchable manner starting from 1923 up to this day, and you look up by keywords, looking up any topic about interwar Poland. One particular favorite of mine is the Wolf Lefkovic collection, which is a series of letters a man in Poland wrote to his nephew in Chicago. And this whole correspondence was preserved by the nephew and eventually was given to MIT for some reason, I don't know exactly why, and it's online. And just to read from year to year the correspondence of the letters coming from Poland about the desperate situation of his family, trying to make a living, the discrimination he faced, the question of education for his children, and many, many more. It's just worthwhile looking at just random letters in this collection. And finally, there's a way of looking at Polish Jewry in color, a rare color film made by a Jewish tourist in the summer of 1939. Mamash on the eve of the outbreak of World War II, Dr. Benjamin Gasul, what happened? I lost it. Sorry. No, the other way. How do we get the film to play?
Just click right there.
There we go. This doesn't have any sound. It's 2 minutes taken in the Jewish quarter in Warsaw. You can see the differences in dress between the traditionally dressed Jews and the more modern dressed Jews. Mostly unemployed people sleeping on the sidewalk looking for work. and people clowning for the camera of the tourist. And here, again, clowning for the camera, putting one of the things that one of the Jewish porters would have to carry, putting it on the back of someone and forcing him to walk on the street. And one Jewish woman we get to see in this short film, and we get to see a couple of little girls. But again, the Hasidic dress of Polish Jews in those days. And here is the courtyard with the stores opening onto the courtyard and people walking, and again looking at the camera, smiling. And again, clowning for the camera. And here's a Jew setting up his stand in the alley there. Another old Jew looking through his window. Here's a little girl and another little girl that we get to see in the courtyard. And Jewish faces in color. This is unique. We don't have anything like this other than this one film. We have colorized films, but this is the only one taken in color at the time. And here one Jew doesn't want to have himself photographed, puts his hand over, at least for a second. And here coming into the main street, and this will be the end of the film. So how do we sum up? Interwar Polish Jewry is a Jewry of contrasting realities. The large variety of political parties, it's the height of diaspora Jewish politics, but on the other hand, meager achievements in attaining the goals of those parties. In many ways, this heightened the vehemence of the internal Polish Jewish struggle among the parties, since there was just frustration achieving goals in the larger Polish plane of politics. Jewish autonomy never really reached the full range of autonomy that was envisioned by the minorities treaties, which would have included, by the way, even public schools where the language of instruction was Yiddish, where there was a significant majority of Jewish students. This didn't happen anywhere in Poland. There were schools in Ukrainian, but there were no schools in Yiddish. But the patterns of discrimination that continued throughout the period. There was an unprecedented, again, variety of Jewish educational institutions. However, the majority of Jewish children were educated in public schools. There was a rather large established Jewish middle class, about a third of Polish Jewry. Remember, that's like 1 million Jews, versus extensive poverty. But yet there were methods for redistribution through charitable organizations, both within Poland and with help from organizations such as the Joint, or from so-called Landsmannschaften, that is, people who came from a particular town who sent money to their old hometown. There was an extensive Yiddish press and publications in Yiddish and Hebrew, but there is a steady Polonization, both of the Jewish press and of the younger generation. There's an unprecedented expansion of yeshivot, both Lithuanian, Musar, and Hasidic, and the Beis Yaakov schools, but there are at the same time clear trends of secularization. About this we'll talk next time. So finally, our conclusion, to go back to our original questions. Anytime we talk about interwar Polish Jewry, there's always the lingering question of what if? What if the Holocaust had not happened? I know this is, counterfactual. This is alternative history. But we see trends developing in those 20 years of the interwar period, particularly the trend toward more and more Polonization of Polish Jews. We see trends, economic trends, professional trends changing in that period. But again, we don't know how things would have played out had the war not come and the destruction of most of Polish Jewry. But Poland has to be remembered, and here we have to thank Ezra Mendelsohn for stressing this point in many of his articles, that Poland was a training ground for Jewish politics, for Jewish democracy. Jews learned how to be parliamentarians. Jews learned how to carry on a debate. Now, it may have been raucous debate, like some of them that we've seen in the Knesset in the past weeks or so, and the Polish parliament was also a good competitor to the Knesset in that matter. But there was a continuation of this political heritage, even the very political parties themselves, in the land of Israel. In about a year or so, I have an article talking about what is the Polish heritage of Polish Jewish politics and Polish politics in the land of Israel. We'll have to wait a year till that article comes out. But again, our opening question, was interwar Poland good or bad for the Jews? It's a mixed picture. If we go with our original terms for our series, Jews remain for many Poles strangers. For many Poles, they were neighbors, but at a distance. And their citizenship was citizenship on condition. Now, this does not mean that there were not many friendships, even close friendships, between Jews and Poles. But for many Poles, Jews were strangers, remained strangers. We're citizens, but not full citizens. We're always, in a certain way, suspect. So that our picture is mixed. There was a lot good, but there was also a lot bad. Polish Jewry on the eve of the Holocaust still had vitality. There still was a search for options, for emigration to the land of Israel, to other countries, to the United States, but many of those options were closed off. So Polish Jews were, in a sense, trapped in Poland and had to make their way. They did the best they could under difficult circumstances. And what happened in the interwar period, and in many ways, set the stage for what would happen in the next terrible period, that of the Holocaust. But that, of course, is a subject for another lecture and for another series. Thank you very much.
Well, Gershon, thank you very much. You can take a sip of water and I'll talk for a second. I did want to say that quite a few people have been asking if we could get the information, the books you mentioned and the website. So I'm asking you and letting everyone know that if it's okay with you, maybe you could gather the information and we can send it to everyone who participated. Because I think people are very interested in looking up the books and websites, and they can't do it through the PowerPoint, but I'm sure we could send the information to them, right?
Okay, fine. I will do that. Thank you, Tamar.
Great. Now, Menachem Golmitz is asking, hi Menachem, why was anti-Semitism in Poland more than in other places in Eastern Europe?
I wouldn't necessarily say that is true. I think that anti-Semitism, first of all, in Poland, we have to say with everything, there was no anti-Semitic legislation. Polish Jewish citizenship was never rescinded. In other countries, Hungary, Romania, there were anti-Jewish laws and there were attempts to rescind Jewish citizenship. This didn't happen in Poland. So I wouldn't necessarily say that anti-Semitism was the worst. And we're not even talking about Germany, of course. But also in Latvia, there were also some strong anti-Jewish movements. In all of Eastern Europe, there were. We can't help it but say, but anti-Semitism was very popular. It's not by accident that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was the second highest bestseller in Europe in the interwar period after the Bible. So anti-Semitism had an audience, had a market. But I wouldn't say that Poland was the worst. It's not necessarily good, but not necessarily the worst.
Okay. Atiana wants to know, when you speak about religious people, do you mean Orthodox or not necessarily?
There was a very small, what we call modernist or reform movement in Poland. We'll talk about that next time a little bit. But for the most part, Jewry in Poland was Orthodox Jewry, and the Jewry that you rejected was Orthodox Jewry. So that also is important, that the model of Jewry that people rejected when they became secular was Orthodox Jewry. So there was some liberal Judaism also on its beginning steps. If you remember the picture of the funeral in Warsaw from 1861, where you had both Rabbi Meisels and Marcus Jastrow at the funeral, and Marcus Jastrow was the rabbi of the single Reform congregation in Warsaw at the time. So even in the middle of the 19th century, there was a small Reform presence.
Okay. How much did religion play a role in the lack of protection for minorities in the newly formed countries post-World War I?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
If minorities weren't protected in the newly formed countries, was it a religious issue, I guess, or something else?
It was religious, national, ethnic. Remember that the minorities, except for the Jews, had their compatriots on the other side of the border. So they could be considered potentially a fifth column, right? So you have a German minority in Poland. You have a Ukrainian minority in Poland. You have a Belarusian minority in Poland. You have a Lithuanian minority in Poland. And right next door, there's a Lithuanian state, a Belarusian state, a Ukrainian state, German state, so that they were considered to be not necessarily totally loyal to their new citizenship. So it's not just religion. First of all, many of them, or almost all of them, are Catholic. Sometimes they are Orthodox Christians. But I don't think that plays the major role. I think it's more the national ethnic role which is important.
Okay, I'll take a last question here. Where would you say the Czechs stand on the spectrum of anti-Semitism? What grade do they get?
They get a pretty high grade. That in Czechoslovakia, there was a tradition of liberal politics, first of all, with President Masaryk, a leading figure, pro-Zionist, also visited Eretz Yisrael. There's Kfar Masaryk, named after him. In general, Jews had it much better in Czechoslovakia than other countries. There was less discrimination. There was, again, no real anti-Semitic parties until you get to the war period, when in Slovakia you have, in a sense, a fascist regime which is set up after the German conquest. But in the interwar period, Czechoslovakia has about the best record in that part of Europe, other than, again, Yugoslavia, which also had a fairly good record in the interwar period. During the war period, again, there are some problematic groups and nations, national groups in Yugoslavia. But those two countries, and Estonia, which had a tiny Jewish community of less than 1,000, they have about the best record about anti-Semitism in that period.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bacon. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you join us next week for our last session. And it was my mistake about the time change. Israel is changing first, and then the United States. So 8 p.m. next week in Israel, 2 p.m. EST, have a good evening or good day. Thank you much. Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks to all.